Hey everyone. Um, I thought we'd talk about something else today that I was thinking about recently and found it interesting. And this is about what we consider normal and what we consider surprising and what we should consider normal instead about human history. And this was brought on by the realization that um human beings, Homo sapiens, have been around for uh, roughly 300,000 plus years. And, we cram recorded history into, say, a few thousand years. And we assume somehow that for the prior hundreds of thousands of years, sort of like nothing happened. Uh, and then everything suddenly happened at that last 1%. And so I'm not trying to answer the question of why, what are the factors that led to this or something like that. That's not the theme here. Rather, it's like why do we consider that normal? Why do we assume this default state where there's this giant blank slate for 95% of this timeline, or maybe even 99% of this timeline, and assume that if you ever find anything there, it's surprising. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to explore this in a few aspects, and one is to do a thought experiment where, let's say, you remove your bias in terms of um, recent whatever you know about the timeline of discovered artifacts and stuff. Let's say you knew that human beings had been around for this several 100,000 year period, and you know something about human beings by the fact that you are one and you see people around you, and you know that, okay, people talk to each other, they work together, they like to do certain things, they like to engage in certain activities, they have certain interests. There are certain patterns of behavior at certain scales, small scale, large scale, that human beings are sort of culturally inventive. You see people capable of doing that. You see that, um, you know uh, in recent history, patterns of uh, culture have arisen and dissolved. Technology has progressed and then sometimes been lost. Trade networks have grown, sometimes collapsed, and now if you take this assumption about how you find people around and you sort of crank forward time a few thousand years, you'd expect some things to happen. If you crank forward 100,000 years, you would expect all kinds of stuff to happen. Um, Maybe I would say you expect some sort of all kinds of wild outcomes, maybe even a total absolute mess, but you wouldn't expect nothing to happen. So, to be clear, this is not um, going overboard in trying to mention any specific form of alternative history or make any Atlantis references, but it's just about um, focusing on what your default assumption is here and then what it should be here. You would expect, if you like take these default human behavior experiences that you have and you turn this crank forward, you would expect that some social systems, political systems would arise and then some would collapse, some would outlive others, some would last for centuries, some wouldn't. Some things would be invented and then forgotten, some bits of knowledge would be acquired and then lost, some things would be built and then destroyed, some various scales of civilization would arise and then be lost. Various forms of literacy would arise and then be lost. These because you do see that both kinds of changes happen. There is, even in very recent history, you can see it's true of, say, regions in the world where, um, say things have been built and then been abandoned. So why would we assume that the prior 95 or 90 to 99% of human history would be so different, right? Finding evidence of this sort of interesting human behavior shouldn't be a surprise or an aberration to the model. It should be the default model. And then if you bring, now we had this sort of thought experiment in terms of just taking human behavior as it is now, but if we add back what we know from archaeology, it only makes things more interesting, in the sense that if you take findings that happened in the last, say, 20, 30 years, but not in the 100 or 200 years before that, things like Gobekli Tepe, which show that, which invert, let's say, the textbook understanding of human history, the textbook understanding being, maybe humans have been around for tens of thousands of years, and then, they have agriculture, and then surplus, and then settlements, and then organized religion, and then monuments. Well, it turns out, like, first of all, humans have been around for way, way, way longer than 30,000 years, 50,000, 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 years. And also, since I mentioned Gobekli Tepe, it looks like, you have monuments without agriculture or settlement. So, symbolic behavior turns out to be older, construction turns out to be older, these exchange networks which indicate trade routes, etc., turn out to be older. Evidence of seafaring turns out to be older. And the general pattern is, whenever something like this is sort of discovered or found, etc., it's presented as some sort of like a surprise, where, it's like, look, humans were doing this thing surprisingly early. And what I'm trying to say is, given this giant long timeline, we should not treat these things as surprising. We should treat these things as sort of just affirming the normal expectation. There's another aspect which is, which I think should inform your statistical expectations, which is, the nature of archaeology, because whenever you find stuff that survives, and things survive differently. Stone survives differently from wood, or things you look for, like human bones, etc. The way they are preserved depends on the soil, and things change, landscapes change, rivers move, especially if you consider longer timelines. Then even coastlines move, and you see these things change in say, few thousands of years. You would expect much bigger changes in tens of thousands of years, and huge changes in hundreds of thousands of years. Even what is that? The Sahara used to be this green, lush place, maybe 10, 15,000 years ago, something like that, which is such a small fraction of several 100,000 years. So how many more such radical changes would you expect? When you consider things like the march of glaciers, consider how, a glacier moving across any piece of land would just completely obliterate stuff under it, etc. So, evidence of absence is not absence of evidence, etc. That is also something that should impact your default assumption about what to expect. And so, one way to maybe summarize this is that your sense of normal and surprising ought to be inverted, which is, instead of saying, look, this weird discovery needs an extraordinary explanation, you should think about the fact that, look, humans like us, okay, biologically the same, seem to have existed for an extraordinarily long time. And, given what you know about human beings living in different conditions, producing enormously varied cultures, and regular evidence from deep time is difficult to preserve. So occasional discoveries of surprising complexity are not disruptions to some normal picture, but rather confirming what should be the normal picture. That sort of makes the past more normal, really, not less. The this blank region on this historical map shouldn't be this baseline. You know, the anomaly is not finding this one odd thing here and there, right? The anomaly would be finding absolutely nothing, because that means that, biologically identical people somehow sat around and did absolutely nothing for 95 to 99% of the species existence, and somehow magically woke up in the last 1%, right? One However, to concede this sort of the devil's advocate position here, maybe that is true, though. It is possible that actually, yes, nothing much happened for some unknown reason for all these hundreds of thousands of years, and then only happened in the last 5-10,000 years. It's possible there is some explanation related to maybe climate variation or something like that. Something disturbed things, something prevented human beings from settling down, some unknown factor. But then that would be like the mystery, uh, that should be the default mystery, as in, why is this timeline so blank? What were people doing for so long? So anyway, trying to wrap up, you should not think of any ideas about complex human behavior tens of thousands of years ago as something surprising. I would rather look, there were people, in fact, variety of human species earlier on, but that's topic for another day. There were people like us. They had, cultures, or they had a predilection towards culture as we do, and they existed on this earth for an incomprehensibly long time. And that that should be your lens of viewing things, not necessarily trying to make a case for this or that version of alternate history, but just saying that you should expect some. It shouldn't be some sort of strange, controversial thing to talk about lost civilizations. Lost civilizations should just be the default assumption. It's like, of course, there would be not one or two or three, but like just hundreds of these things naturally arising in the course of time. Just because you take people, you turn this crank forward, you expect something to happen. Just statistically, you expect certain percentages of the population to be predisposed to doing this or that, and not yeah, the bottom line is, you shouldn't expect human beings to sit around for hundreds of thousands of years and do nothing. All right. It's not clear what they were doing, but you should treat that blankness as the mystery. All right. I think I've sort of repeated myself a few times here. I'm going to stop now. Hopefully that was at least mildly interesting, and we'll return with something else later. Cheers.